All right, here we are. Okay, welcome everybody. I believe you are seeing our welcome Swampscott Conservancy logo. So thanks everybody for joining us this evening. Please remain muted until our Q&A or until Melanie Garate. If she asks the crowd a question, you can feel free to unmute at that point. But just for kind of keeping things clean, particularly with our audio recording, if you can remain muted until you are ready to speak to the entire group, it is greatly appreciated. Again, I'm Colleen Hitchcock. I'm a member of the board for the Swampscott Conservancy. Thank you again for joining us this evening. We're super excited to have our guest speaker tonight, but for those who aren't familiar with the Conservancy or are joining us from another group, just a quick introduction to who we are here in Swampscott with the Conservancy. So we have a four-pronged approach to working to preserve our open spaces and support our open spaces. And we do education events such as this virtual one this evening. We also have done in-person events and some outdoor events as well. And hopefully we'll be getting back to more in-person events as the situation allows. We do citizen science work using iNaturalist and MyCoast. And so hopefully some people got out this past weekend for the King Tide to document our super high tide. And we have another one coming up, I believe the first week in December that will, I think should be even a little bit higher. So we'll be sending out some notices about that as well. And we do habitat improvement and community buildings. And community building can be our hiking trails or birding with us or just getting to meet us at the local farmers market. We are currently embarking upon our 2021-22 annual membership drive. You can join us over on Facebook to become a member of the Conservancy. You're obviously already on our mailing list, but if you would like to support the work that we do, we encourage you to please join and support us. This evening, our talk is co-sponsored by the Town of Swampscott Conservation Commission, the Swampscott Public Library, and the Unitarian Universalist Church of Greater Lynn. And so I want to say thank you to our co-sponsors for helping to bring Melanie to us here in Swampscott this evening. And finally, our next upcoming event is the Town of Swampscott and the Swampscott Conservancy are hosting the Mass-Based Science Walk. It will be up at Fisherman's Beach beginning on late afternoon on Thursday through December 6th. And so come on down to Fisherman's and check out the science walk to learn about all of the cool science through Mass-Based that's happening here in the Boston Harbor area. And with that, I will switch gears and welcome this evening's guest speaker. And so the Conservancy is super excited to host Melanie Garate from the Mystic River Watershed Association, and she'll be speaking to us this evening on social resilience in the realms of climate change within the Mystic River. Melanie is the Climate Resiliency Project Manager for the Mystic River Watershed. She's got a diverse background from traditional science research to now working at the interface of community building and climate change and social resilience with Myra. And with that, I will hand it over to Melanie to complete the story of who she is and the work that she is doing here with the Mystic River Watershed. All right, it's all you.
Thanks so much, Colleen. Let me just get my slides up here. So nice to meet you all and see you. I actually just lost you in my double screen. Where did we go? Okay, 1 second. It's nice to see people's faces, even virtually. There we go. All right, well, yeah, so I will be talking about regional climate resilience and social resilience in the greater Boston area for people and place. And I'll start off by sharing my background and then go into our regional climate resilience work and then drill into 2 projects that have a social equity and resilience component. And then I'll leave room for questions at the end, but if you have questions throughout the presentation, you can put them in the chat or just raise your hand. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, even though my computer is being a little funky right now. All right, so as Colleen mentioned, I have a diverse background. So in my past life, I like to say that I examined how people contributed to climate change and its impacts on coastal systems. So my training is really in marine ecology and climate science. And I looked at how greenhouse gas fluxes were influenced by warming and excess nutrients, so anthropogenic nutrients, into mangroves in Puerto Rico, and then also coral reefs and within the harbor here in the Boston area. And I got to do a lot of fun things, including as an undergrad intern at the aquarium, and then also did some work in the Neponset River watershed, and included being with some fun animals. I went on to grad school to look at nitrous oxide production, which is the top greenhouse gas, the most potent greenhouse gas. It's 3 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and understanding how warming and nutrient impacted that area. So I was able to do lots of fun traveling and events, and throughout all of this time, I also was doing a lot of community outreach on the side. And so I was an outreach scientist for the University of Rhode Island, working with Providence youth, as well as doing programs for younger elementary school children. So I was really passionate about also connecting people to the outdoors, especially people of color and immigrants, such as myself. I'm also an immigrant. I was born in Chile and learned and got all of my passion for the ocean from my dad by just spending all day within the Pacific Ocean. And so I realized that my passion was actually at this intersection of community and of science. And so after graduate school, I went on to work for Mass Audubon in the Coastal Water Bird Program and the Boston Nature Center. So there I was able to do what I love to do, was get people outdoors, get people of color outdoors, do conservation work with wildlife, specifically endangered shorebirds like the piping plover, which you may know, love or hate, don't tell me, because I love them, and they're so adorable. But you know, they do nest on beaches, and so some people don't like that portion of it. But it was really, really wonderful work. I also partnered with the New England Aquarium in this picture on the right, doing citizen science or volunteer science with the community to try to understand what these animals were eating and how that was impacting their survival. And then I got to the point where I realized that I kind of plateaued in that position, and I wanted to go back to more of the science piece and try to use my background in climate change in particular. And so that led me to my present life and looking at how people were impacted by climate change instead of how we were impacting climate change. I wanted to understand, well, there's all of these communities that are vulnerable to climate. It's not only our natural environment, it's actually people, and it's also happening in the Boston area. And so as I, throughout my career, as I did research and as I did community outreach, I also started to see that discrepancy between those affluent communities who have access or more access to green spaces and blue spaces and environmental education and education overall, compared to those who have lower access to it. And so I started to realize, and I didn't have the words for it at the moment, you know, I didn't know about environmental justice. I didn't really understand climate justice. That wasn't in my training, but I started to see those themes play out. And so by the time I got to the Mystic River Watershed Association, I was more and more involved in that climate justice work. And so I'll go into a little background on the Mystic River. If you're not aware, this is a river that goes into the Boston Harbor. So it's one of the 3 rivers that empties into the harbor. The other 2 are obviously the Charles and then Neponset River. And these networks and streams combine 76 square miles. And just for comparison, it's a very small area. It's actually about the size of Brooklyn or about the size of Amsterdam. And so it's a relatively small area, but it has a lot of people living within that area, and that's mostly in the lower part of that watershed. So about 500,000 people live within the lower part of our watershed, and that is the highly industrialized part of Boston and of the Mystic. And it's also where most of the environmental justice communities and people of color, low income and immigrant communities are as well. At the Mystic or Myra, we protect our water. So we do water quality work. We also do habitat restoration, especially for the river herring, those lovely herring that have, we've been able to build herring ladders so they can climb up the ladder during their migration and spawn within the river. And we also work on greenways, and so creating parks and paths along the river for walking and for running. And for cycling. And then we also do a lot of environmental education work. And my focus is on climate resiliency. And so for clarification around what is climate resilience is focusing to help communities adapt and prepare for the worst impacts of climate. And so this is different than focusing on carbon reduction and clean energy. It's really focusing on how can we as people adapt our built environment and our natural environment to climate resilience. So that can look simply like these rain gardens that are installed to capture all of that excess storm water, like turning very gray streets to some green streets and providing more tree canopy in urban areas. And it can also look like emergency deployment of floodgates to keep all of that excess stormwater or sea level rise out whenever needed. And so it can look like a variety of things. And mostly what the climate science resilience sector is focused on today is the environment. So protecting our habitat, protecting those wildlife that we care about so much. And then also focused on protecting property, especially that property that are of high value, like homes along the coast or those luxury condos that have sprung up in the Boston area, as well as other coastal cities. But what is not typically focused or put into front of mind when creating resilience planning is focusing on the people who live there, and especially those most vulnerable people. And that is what I was brought on to do at Myra, is making sure that we're focusing on the environment because that's important, making sure to focus on property because that is important, but then also making sure to include people within that story and understand how they're impacted and what their vulnerabilities are. And so climate resilience for people and place is truly our focus at Myra. And for that, we have created the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, or the RMC. And so the Resilient Mystic Collaborative is a partnership among 21 communities within our watershed to solve climate resilience challenges that no single municipality can do alone. And so right now, what is typically done to build climate resilience within municipalities is, those municipalities like Somerville, Boston, Cambridge that have a lot of funding tend to work together or tend to work alone to build climate resilience strategies. But it's much more effective and also cost effective to work regionally, especially if we're thinking about flood pathways. Flooding doesn't know municipal boundaries, and what's impacting Chelsea is also likely impacting Everett. And so it makes sense to work as a regional collaborative to tackle these challenges. And it also makes sense to do so because of the different the different priorities and the different funding that these municipalities have. And so if we work regionally, we're actually able to leverage the priorities and the affluence that perhaps the city of Boston has along with municipalities that don't have a lot of funding, like Everett or Chelsea. And so that way we can help each other try and solve climate resilience, or increase climate resilience, excuse me. And so what climate change impacts are we talking about in Boston? I'm sure a lot of you know this, but I'll go over it just in case. Most of the climate change impacts that are happening along our coast is coastal flooding, so sea level rise, or due to storm surge. We're getting a lot more, or we're getting extreme storms. And so not necessarily the number of storms are increasing, but the intensity. So the amount of water that is coming down at us in one time. I think we remember this summer, it was very rainy, lots of extreme storms happening. And that has been happening more frequently, and it will continue to happen more frequently in our area. And lastly, the one that we don't often talk about is extreme heat or extreme temperatures during the summertime. And I'll go into much more in depth in a minute. Let's first talk about what makes people more vulnerable to climate change than others. So if we think about it through the lens of COVID, everybody has been impacted by COVID, but not everybody has been impacted the same. And so, for example, my life was disrupted, yes, but I was able to have the ability to work from home. And so I was able to actually increase my capacity at work and stay relatively safe from COVID, and so was my family. However, those who are frontline workers, or why am I forgetting the term that we're all using, but you know what I mean, folks who are essential workers, there we go, did not face the same throughout COVID time. And so that is similar to climate impacts. And so if maybe people can put in the chat what you think would make some folks more vulnerable to climate change than others, we can talk through them, or you can simply unmute to get a little audience interaction here. I see Sammy and Jack smiling over there. Access to cars versus public transport, exactly. So some folks are able to get out of harm's way from climate than others, exactly. Access to AC, yeah, so during the summertime, some folks are able to pay for using AC or have central air, and so they're able to afford that, while others don't have that same opportunity, exactly. So some folks are more exposed to climate change than others. So obviously, if you're living by the coast or you're living on a floodplain, then you're likely to be more exposed to flooding and storm surge. And so some folks are able to get out of harm's way due to that exposure, like having a car or being able to afford to move your entire family out of the coast. Some folks are more sensitive, so those who are elderly or who are younger, below the age of 5, are not able to regulate their temperature as well. And so they're more sensitive to extreme heat waves, similar to folks who have diabetes or respiratory issues like asthma. They're also more sensitive to climate hazards than others. And lastly, some people are able to adapt. So they have that bounce back factor. If they're flooding in their homes, maybe they're able to repair it quickly. Or again, they're able to simply move somewhere else and adapt to it. And so not everybody is impacted the same by climate change, even though everybody will be impacted, right? And so in regards to extreme temperatures, that is one main concern in Boston and throughout the US and throughout the world, but is going really under the radar because it's kind of this silent threat. It's known as the silent killer of climate change. It is the #1 cause of death in the United States due to weather, and it's actually compared to all the combinations of weather-related events. And this is often not talked about, especially in the Boston area, since we're known as a blizzard and nor'easter culture. We're not known as a heat wave culture. We actually look forward to the summer, right? It's like, finally, we're getting out of the cold, we're getting more daylight. This is wonderful. But now what the summer is turning into is lots of very, very humid days, multiple days above 90 degrees, and then also lots of rain. And so one way that this is happening and that it's affecting folks disproportionately is through the urban heat island effect. So the urban heat island effect is essentially islands are created predominantly in cities, and those are in areas that have high gray infrastructure or impervious surfaces that are able to trap the heat that is coming from the sun instead of reflecting it back, which is what happens in greener areas. And so in greener areas, you see a lower temperature, and in urban heat islands, there can be up to 20 degrees hotter than those surrounding greener areas. And so this is something that has also been impacted by racist policies dating back to the 1930s. So redlining is one of those policies that have affected the quality of housing, and then also some focusing on areas or combining neighborhoods to make those neighborhoods hotter. So this is a map of the Boston area, and this is a map that can be found on Mapping Inequality. If you just look that up, you can find it. And so I'll just give a little background. I think some folks already know about redlining, but just in case you don't, in the 1930s, the FDR administration and banks and homeowners loans companies created a map and designated some areas as best or still desirable areas where people can be given homeowner and small business loans. And the areas that were deemed definitely declining or hazardous, or yellow and red or redlined, were areas that were not given those homeowner or small business loans. And those areas that were C or D were areas where predominantly people of color and immigrants lived. And so during that time in the 1930s, people of color and immigrants were predominantly Italian, Irish, and Jewish descendants from Europe, and also Black folks. And so in these areas, the neighborhoods were, not given those small business loans, and so there weren't that many banks, there weren't, clothes and food shops, et cetera, and so they were really in poor condition. And so the legacy of redlining still remains today in these areas. And so this is the Roxbury neighborhood. This is predominantly Dorchester that have remained areas that are of people of color and low income, because those folks were not awarded that financial stability that has come from purchasing homes, which is the main way to have upward mobility in the United States, which is different outside of the United States. And the folks who were foreign-born white were seen as people of color at that time, but then eventually they were able to grow in the socioeconomic class and were able to have upward mobility compared to Black people and people of color immigrants from other places. And so if we look at redlining in the Mystic River watershed, we created a map here to show, and then we compared it to heat exposure for homes in the same area. And so you can see that the same areas that were redlined are also the predominantly hotter areas and also very urban areas. And so we also looked at the vegetation cover in these areas. So the same areas had lower percent vegetated land cover compared to our upper watershed, which is predominantly affluent areas and also white areas. And so these areas have more resilience to heat, which is a good thing, but we need to get these areas in the lower part of the watershed to also be resilient to extreme heat. This is basically showing the same thing, just comparatively. And so one example of the impacts of this is during the deadly heat wave of Chicago in 1995. And so if you don't know what happened, there was an extreme heat wave, which is above 90 degrees for at least 3 days. So this was for about 5 to 7 days, so almost a week. And there was a high death toll just a few days after the hottest days. And these were predominantly in Black neighborhoods of Chicago. And there have been many studies done, including a book that you can look up. And then there's also a documentary on this Chicago heat wave of 95. They looked at different neighborhoods and who fared well and who didn't. And they compared different people of color neighborhoods to each other. And they saw that people of color who had more social equity and they had more access to air conditioning, such as going into stores or malls or libraries or other places where people gathered, and then also had more like a better social structure set up for them, like going to a neighbor's or had family nearby, they fared better than similar people of color neighborhoods that fared really poorly. And so those that fared really poorly were elderly folks who were living alone, and also in really poor neighborhoods that didn't have those social connections, didn't have access to those malls or stores or movie theaters or libraries that they could go to cool off. And so the death toll was huge, and the city was really burdened by all of this. And there was also a lot of mismanagement from the city, from the state, from the police, from the firefighters. There was just like not enough communication and emergency response to tackle this. And so we don't want that within the Mystic River watershed. And so we created a plan to try to understand where the extreme heat islands are in the Mystic in order to start to get to answer these questions and create a better plan to not have the Chicago heat wave happen in the Boston area. And so what we did was we created a citizen or volunteer science campaign to engage volunteers around extreme heat and air quality called Wikihop Mystic. You may have heard of Wikihop Boston. That was led by the Museum of Science 2 years ago. This is an extension of that program to cover the entirety of our watershed. And so we're still partnering with the Museum of Science on this, and Kappa Strategies, which is the data team that we have. And so the purpose is to, again, get people to understand that extreme heat is a risk, but then also have an action that they could do. Lots of folks don't, you know, they're so stressed about climate, but then they don't really have any action items that they feel like they can do. So this is also making it so that people can be incorporated into the solutions and understanding of what is happening right in their neighborhood. We also collected stories via IC Change. So it's also really important to not just collect quantitative data, but also qualitative data. And the outcome is to create a detailed map that will be modeled of the heat islands and cool spots. And then also part 2, after we get all of the data and analyze it, is create and plan for Mystic communities for solutions on how to cool off these areas. And so what we first did is create a list of different stakeholders who know where all of the hotspots are. And so we reached out to the Resilient Mystic Collaborative municipal partners, city staff, and then organizations that we've partnered with. We then created transects where cars could drive around those areas. And then we got feedback from those same stakeholders on those transects. And so the way we collected the data is we attached these sensors to the window of a car. And this is the air temperature sensor, and the air quality sensor was on the other side. And then we drove the different transects throughout the watershed during 4 different times within a 24-hour period. So in total, we had 20 car routes, 2 bike routes. We also made it available for bikers. And then also 3 stationary air quality sensors for comparison. So it really did look like this big mess. On that day, just for a little background on this volunteer recruitment, we set it for the 10th and 11th of August because that is what the weather channel told us. But then it turned out to be rainy and we couldn't collect data on a rainy day. And so we had to move it. And we had to do a lot of social media and volunteer gathering for it. Thank God for my summer intern who helped me out with all of the scheduling and volunteer outreach. Really appreciate her. This is what some of the scheduling looked like, and then all of the different transects here within our watershed. And then when we wrapped up, we ended up having to drop 3 of the transects because one of the sensor malfunction, and then 2 volunteers of 2 main data sets didn't show up. But in total, we had 80 volunteers and 70 data collection runs, which was huge. It was a really big undertaking, and we were thankfully able to collect the data. And here are some pictures. This is David Sittenfeld from the Museum of Science. You can see he was nicely masked along with the dinosaur. And then some other volunteers from Myra, including myself and my friend who did the Cambridge run. And so the next steps for this work is to get the results, obviously, by December. So that should be coming up. And so we will have air quality and ambient air temperature maps. And then we will also share the results with the community. So the community is the big push here. We don't want to just keep this data for us or for just research sake. We want to share it back to the community and verify or ground truth. Is this right? Like, does this make sense? We also want to start getting feedback on what do you think the solutions could be? And we have some funding to involve artists. How can we visualize this? How can we reach out to the community? And then we hope to do this both online and in person, and also be able to compare our results to demographic data as well as, things like vegetation cover, and get really granular, more granular even than this map that is just focused on municipalities. And so this is what Wikihop Boston looked like 2 years ago. And so we'll have a map like this, but for the entire watershed, and it will be zoomable. And so you can see all of the intricacies depending on the land cover. And by the end, we hope that together we can help science and for our neighbors. So help for climate change, for science, and for each other. And I'll play this cute video. Hopefully you can hear it. How is this?
This was a lot of fun. I am so grateful. And I have to help science.
So that's just one little snippet of folks who were able to participate. And I'll move on now to a second project. So I know I have about 20 minutes, right? This will probably take 10 minutes or so. So our other project is the Lower Mystic Vulnerability Assessment. And this is focused on flooding. So we're switching from heat over to flooding. And this project is focusing on what and who are impacted by extreme storms and how can we protect both. And this is focused in the lower part of our watershed. So those areas in Green Somerville, Charlestown and East Boston, Chelsea, Everett, Revere, and Winthrop, which is a little bit cut off. And so This project is focused on the critical infrastructure that is within the lower Mystic. So critical infrastructure is a term deemed by federal agencies. That is, if these infrastructure pieces were to fail, we would be in big trouble. And so those that are within the Mystic, the lower part of our watershed, is the Amelia Earhart Dam. And so that is a dam that has essentially created the lower and upper Mystic Lakes. And if that were to flood and overtop, it would essentially make Malden tidal again, as well as flood many municipalities. And so Malden used to be a tidal river, and now that area has essentially shrunken down, and there's lots of homes, including the Cambridge Health Alliance Community Health Center within that floodplain. And so we would be in big trouble if that were to flood. There's also a lot of oil terminals. So if that were to flood, oil spills within our waters. There's the MBTA, so all the T and bus lines. And then there's the New England Produce Center, which is the port, the main port for all of New England's fresh fruits and vegetables and the Canadian Maritimes. And so if that were to flood, which is actually pictured here, it causes huge delays. And you can just imagine, even right now, as we're going through this supply chain disruption. And then there's the Logan Airport, which I think you can imagine what would happen there. And so what we did was we created a fake storm, similar to the Superstorm Sandy that went through New York. And we got a meteorologist to give us the updates. And so essentially what happened is we got all of these infrastructure managers together in one Zoom room. It was supposed to happen in real life, but then COVID happened. And we gave them, this was over the course of 3 days, but there were 5 exercise days. And so day 1, okay, here's the weather report, the storm's coming tomorrow. Okay, day 2, okay, it's starting to hit, and then day 3, et cetera. And it just kept intensifying. And so through that, these infrastructure managers were able to see what would break, what emergency response they needed or they didn't have. And so that way we can plan what to do and how to fix it. And that is normally what happens during a vulnerability infrastructure or vulnerability assessment. And then there is a costs benefit analysis that is done to prioritize what gets fixed first and what doesn't, et cetera. And the novel part about this project is we did a part 2. And so we again focused on people, and we did a social vulnerability assessment in parallel to the infrastructure assessment. And so what we did was we contracted with community-based organizations to help us create surveys and focus group discussions to understand how people, those most vulnerable, the priority populations, are impacted by extreme storms, what has happened to them in the past, and what could happen to them in the future if such a big storm were to come, like Hurricane Sandy or like Hurricane Maria. And so these were a couple of the organizations that were contracted, so we made sure to pay them so that way it's equitable. And then we co-created these survey instruments and focus groups with them. And the focus again was on social vulnerability. And so these are just some of the quotes of what we got from the focus groups. One is, we would definitely be disconnected from the world. A week without electricity means that one of the things we used to use most, like a cell phone, could not be used. So that we found out there are a lot of people can only access the internet through their phones. They may not have laptops, they may not have iPads. And so if cell towers are down and if they have no internet access, then they can barely communicate to their community members. And then folks who work on hourly wage are not able to even get to work. Either they don't have cars or public transportation isn't running. And so that would significantly impact how much money they make that week or that month. And that has a huge detriment to themselves and their family. And so the key findings of this Lower Mystic Regional Climate Assessment combined is that those cities, East Boston, Chelsea, Everett, and Revere, that have the highest concentration of critical infrastructure also have the highest percentage of socially vulnerable residents. And the community members and infrastructure managers are really concerned about their ability to maintain communication. And so at the local level, again, people are worried internet's down, cell phone towers are down, can't communicate to each other, don't have an emergency plan. And then also at the top, the critical managers don't know who to contact exactly or how to keep in contact during this extreme weather event and disaster. And so they also don't know where are they on the priority list of fuel deliveries and things like that. There's also a huge reliance on emergency generators that may or may not work, and that fuel may or may not get to them. And then there's also a huge worry that flooding would flood, or an extreme storm would flood the harbor tunnels and the MBTA subway tunnels. And these, if they're down, it's not necessarily like folks can just go to Home Depot to get an extra part or call, their local engineer. There's a whole team that needs to be involved to do these repairs with very, very special parts. So that could take weeks to months to repair. And so that would also impact the community who is reliant on those services. We also, again, need to maintain power and communications. And then lastly, what we learned is that folks within these environmental justice communities rely on their local community health centers. And so if they're down and if they don't have any backup functioning system, they're disproportionately impacted than others who can go to different hospitals to get their routine care, who go elsewhere. And this is especially vulnerable or especially important for people who need electric devices to maintain their health or who need to, get routine care because of a pre-existing health concern. And so all of these wouldn't have gotten this like bigger picture. These key findings wouldn't have gotten this like more community focused picture if we had only done the infrastructure assessment. Now we also understand how to prioritize based on what the community also needs, and especially those who are more vulnerable than others. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and see if anybody has any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Melanie. So we'll do a virtual round of applause. You can either join me on screen or if you want to put a reaction there in Zoom. But thank you so much for sharing everything about the work that Myra is doing locally. It's really fascinating and inspiring to kind of see the magnitude and the scope of everything. I'll open it up to questions from the masses tonight.
Hi, Jim. Do you have a question?
No, someone else she called on.
Oh, Sandy and Jack.
Yeah, I see a lot of development in the Revere area and in Revere Beach in particular. And I'm wondering, do developers have to consider any of these issues when they build a new building?
Yeah, so they have to keep up with the FEMA codes primarily. And so FEMA, the federal agency, emergency management, they have their flood path or their flood metrics that they need to comply with. However, they are rather out of date. And so oftentimes cities provide their own flood resilience models. So that has, I'm not sure 100% with Revere, but cities like Cambridge and Boston have done a lot of work on that with Woods Hole Group to try to assess that. And so there are some standards that they have to comply with. And sometimes there's some compromise that happens to have those built up. such as the Everett Casino that went up, like Encore and things like that. And so sometimes it doesn't get fully up to date as much as we would like. Yeah. Julie says, will you be making the results of Wikihop Mystic study available to the public? Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't mention that. So all of our data will be publicly available, and that was also part of what we asked for in the grant that was given to us by state funds, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Act. And we want to ensure that all of this data is public so people can access it in the future and can run their own data on it or use it to further other work in the future. And we'll be making the rounds definitely to showcase all of this data. And we hope that other parts of Massachusetts also do something similar. Thank you. Jim?
I don't, well, I have a comment and sort of a question, I guess. I ran into a little bit of this situation, even though I live in Swampscott, which is not one of the areas that you're addressing in terms of lower income, or it's not in the Mystic River watershed. But when we had the big storm about 10 days ago, the CVS near me ran out. Their electricity was gone. They had no electricity for quite a while, and they didn't have a backup generator, which kind of surprised me. And they lost all their refrigerated medicines, including all the flu shots. So I went over there to get my flu shot, and the fellow was kind of embarrassed and said, well, I'm sorry, we had to throw away all our flu shots. So even in relatively well-off communities, we have this sort of thing happen. And then the sort of question I have is, I've been thinking a lot about the transfer from natural gas to electricity. And I wonder, if we have a major storm and people can't charge their electric cars because we don't have gasoline powered cars anymore, and we all have electric heat pumps instead of natural gas heat, and it's winter, and all of a sudden we can't heat our homes anymore. I wonder if unintended consequences of moving to electricity is something that people such as yourself think about.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for that comment. And I'm sorry that you couldn't get your flu shot. And I think that
Don't worry about it. I'm not holding you responsible.
No, I know. But I think it just speaks to the fact that, again, everybody will be impacted by climate change, and some folks will be impacted more than others, but we'll definitely all be impacted. And even in these smaller storms, we get these, loss of power, and that has significant impact on our lives. And so we can only imagine what will happen during a really large storm, definitely. And in terms of unintended consequences, of course, I think that is, unfortunately, we are flawed people, and so we make flawed plans, but that is the only way that we can progress. And so there are lots of really smart people thinking about these. I am not a clean energy person, or at least a specialist. I know, surface level, but wouldn't be able to speak to the details of what is needed to actually progress us to the level that we need. But there will definitely be some unintended consequences and some mishaps, but we need to start somewhere. Just like, I don't know, even thinking about the ozone layer, we needed to build lots of momentum for that, and we didn't fix it right away, but we eventually got to the point where we, stopped having to worry about something like that. And so similar to the climate crisis right now, but that's definitely something to consider. But hopefully we'll move towards something that is better than what we have right now.
Thanks.
Melanie, I have a question. So for the vulnerability work that was primarily the towns or municipalities that were in the lower Mystic, has that been replicated anywhere else in Massachusetts or in the Boston area, kind of taking that model of doing both the social surveys along with the infrastructure assessment?
That's a good question. And no, so we just completed that our due date was October 1st. So we're still working through the little, going through a fine tooth comb for the final report. And we're hoping to use this as a model so that others can do similar work and improve upon our work. So, just like we're going to have mishaps with clean energy, we're also, there were some things that we think that we could have done better this time around. The North Suffolk Office of Sustainability and Resilience, which is Revere, Winthrop, and Chelsea, is looking to do a social vulnerability assessment that is similar to us and that builds on top of ours, since they were already included within ours. So that is something that is coming up, and hopefully others will do something similar, like your communities.
Awesome. Thank you. No, it's really, I think it's really kind of inspiring to kind of think about these communities coming together. Have you had any preliminary conversations with leadership in those municipalities about what you have found and how they'll kind of take that information and what they'll do with it?
Yeah, so that is coming up. We're working on that as we speak. And we have, with the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, we have these quarterly meetings. And so this was a project that was really rooted in what the Resilient Mystic Collaborative as a whole wanted to do. And now we're getting ready to really send out, big messaging. It might get to you as well around the report, and people will need to read through it. And then we're going to have our quarterly steering committee meeting to address all of the findings and all of the solutions and the recommendations and what we want to pull forward. And so one of the things will definitely be around communications and oil terminals, and then the other, which I will lead, will be the social resilience piece. Like, how can we be more connected and resilient to all of this, if, when it happens. Hopefully it won't happen this year in terms of the storm. Well, thank you so much for all your questions. This was really wonderful.
Any other questions to round us out this evening? All right. Well, thank you again, Melanie, for joining us. It's really been a pleasure. We look forward to kind of seeing the next steps for Myra and for this work. And I just have to make a plug because this crowd knows me as being a citizen science super fan. And so I have to make a plug for the Mystic Herring virtual herring count. So if you're looking for something fun to kind of kill 5, 10, 2 hours doing online, I totally recommend going and counting some heron from your living room to help support Mystic River Watershed, because we can all do our part to advance science and to help Myra move all of these different agendas forward. So thank you again, Melanie. I'll do another virtual round of applause for you.
Thanks for the plug. And if you ever get a chance, or if you haven't already seen river herring, just climb up the ladder. They're just so cute, and it's just, they're so resilient themselves. So.
The word for the evening for sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining the Conservancy this evening.
Thank you, Melanie.